Hello, welcome back. Yes, we're still in my living room. Just gonna have to deal with it. We're here for another book review. Woohoo! For a book that, wasn't as disappointing as the last one. I know what you're thinking. Julian, don't you like anything anymore? And trust me, I'm wondering the same thing. I actually saw this book on another booktuber's video. They were doing like favorite books that they had read this year or something like that, and they had mentioned not this book, but its sequel, and I was like, you know what? That sounds intriguing. Let's start it out. Let's check out the first one. If you hear any sort of rumbling, thrumming noises, that's the heat on in my house. You guys know, house noises, just a fact of life here. This allows you to imagine that we are together in the same house. The book we're talking about today is The Devouring Gray. Let's read the blurb, shall we? On the edge of a town, a beast haunts the woods, trapped in the gray, its bonds loosening. Uprooted from the city, Violet Saunders doesn't have much hope for fitting into her new school in Four Paths. A town almost buried in the woodlands of rural New York. That is hard for me to say, I don't know why. The fact that she's descended from one of the town's founders doesn't help much, either. Her neighbors treat her with distant respect and something like fear. When she meets Justin, May, Isaac, and Harper, all children of founder families, she sees the otherworldly destruction they can wreak, and starts to wonder if the townsfolk are right to be afraid. When bodies start to appear in the woods, the locals become downright hostile. Can the teenagers solve the mystery of Four Paths and their own part in it before another calamity strikes? See, this sounds very, like, put together and like there is a cohesive story, but I found that the plot of this book was one of its main problems. While a lot of the things mentioned in this blurb do happen in the story, the blurb makes them sound like a bigger deal than they are treated in the book. Like, for example, the townspeople that aren't members of the founding families do not get a lot of screen time, so reading that blurb I was like, do the townspeople really turn against them? Because it doesn't feel much like it. Alright, let's look at my notes. Once again, we are continuing my trend of a main character who's low-key obsessed with her dead sister. What is this thing? It's following me. Every book I pick up with a female lead lately, the main character is obsessed with her either dead or long-lost estranged sister. Why? Why is this following me? Can someone explain? Is one of my sisters going to go missing and the universe is trying to tell me? We have the girl moving into a new town trope, very popular in YA fiction, and this is YA. But honestly, it's not hit very hard. Like, a lot of the beats that you expect, this book doesn't even bother with. I think it's because it knows that you expect them, and so it's like, we're not going to show much of her dealing with school at all. I couldn't even tell you really how her school life was. I don't remember any of it because it was not important. I will give this book one thing, the lore is interesting. This is a weird book because this is one that I kept reading for the lore and not the characters, because the characters, well, we'll get to them in a second. Let's talk about the lore. So we've got the founding families, which feel very, very ripped off from the Harry Potter, like, Hogwarts house founders. These people came to this area of rural New York, hard to say, and they found a magical creature and they had to imprison it, and also these people have certain powers and abilities that are granted only to people in their bloodline, which I must assume leads to a lot of inbreeding. It's not really addressed in the book, but that's something that I, as an adult, am like, But anyway, they rule the town, these four families, and the rest of the townspeople don't matter. That's it. But there's a lot of stuff to do with this lore and these families, such as one of the main characters can read this tarot deck, essentially, but it's like a special deck that has to do with these families and this world and this lore, and I really like it, and I want a deck of my own. Like, every time she's reading those scenes, I'm all about it. And there are, of course, the four families that have the four suits. So we've got sticks, stones, something in bones. Why can't I remember? But anyway, the four suits are the four families. They each have powers, but also they each have tarot cards that pertain to them, and this girl can read them, and I love that. And they each have their own rituals to come into their powers, and it's a whole thing. Plus, you all know that I love a dark, encroaching, inscrutable threat like the forest is, the gray. Unfortunately, it's not very well fleshed out, at least in this book. I'm imagining that in future books it will be. This was definitely very much a first book. Very much a lot of setup. And if you're like me and you wish that books could just kind of stand on their own and have a full story in and of themselves, even if they're part of a series, that's probably going to disappoint you too. So we hop POVs between most of the teenagers who are all conveniently like the same age from the 4 families, including our main character who comes back into town, and then the other kids who were already there, who we all had named in the blurb. And we check out their different POVs, we get a little bit of their lives, but honestly none of them were terribly interesting. There was one girl, Harper, who was kind of interesting. She had a lot going on, didn't really get a chance to explore most of it, but honestly, all of these kids feel pretty copy-paste. Like, if you needed me to differentiate between, like, voice or which character would do what, I couldn't tell you. All of them are pretty bland, and definitely a lot of that sort of YA sort of character that you're more meant to project yourself onto, and you've got, like, 5 options to do that, and all of these characters, super forgettable. And here we run into a big problem. Because the characters are pretty bland and the lore is obviously the most important part for this author, the plot feels really, really choppy. Things just happen. Very little seems to come from the characters themselves. Now, I get it, they are teenagers, and so they don't have a ton of control over their own lives, and so sometimes things do just need to happen to them because adults are moving things along that the teenagers aren't privy to. But so often it feels like there was a scene missing before something happens to these characters, and I was like, it would have been great to see the scene where this was decided, or where this thing was set into motion, instead of just, and then this happened, and then this happened, and the characters just have to go along with it. It just felt like the author was just throwing scenarios at these characters without careful consideration of how those scenarios came about, at least in a way that the reader could see, so it seemed really random a lot of the time. Honestly, I wish that we had gotten the POV of at least one adult. I know this is a YA book, and I know a lot of publishers would be like, nope, we can't have any adult POVs, but if we had had at least one adult's POV, we could have had those missing feeling scenes that could have then led to the teenagers having to deal with things. Everything feels like so choppy and like half an idea in this book. The main character gets undead powers, like she can raise the dead, and she like summons a zombie by accident one time, and that's it. It doesn't really come up. Like, she accidentally resurrects something and she accidentally summons a zombie. But I really wanted it to be where, like, she'd just be walking down the street and another zombie. I almost wanted it to be to the level of annoyance for her, where she's like, fucking hell, I can't walk anywhere without an undead something coming after me. Like, that would have been really cool and interesting. Make it an inconvenience, make it a problem, versus, like, she just deals with it a couple of times so we understand that she has undead powers and then it doesn't really come up again. I'm sure she'll do more with it in future books, but I really wanted it to be a bigger part of this book. Even if it's not a main plot point, it's something that she has to continually deal with. That's what I wanted. Most of the main characters in this book appear to be bisexual, which is fine. Queer people find each other. A little bit convenient that all of them are from these 4 families, but whatever. Maybe it's part of the magic. I don't know. None of the other people in her school matter. Like, we don't get to know any other kids, really, so we don't get to find out who else might be queer. But everybody's bi. It reminded me a little bit of Dragon Age 2, where it's just like everyone's a romanceable option. There might be like one character who's not bi. So I was a little bit torn between being like, that's okay, queer people find each other, especially queer teenagers, but at the same time I'm like, convenient that it's all people in these 4 families. Also, queerness is not really explored in this book, but it may be in a future book. I would like to know how these families react to their children potentially not producing blood offspring. Because if you've got 2 guys that get together, how are you supposed to continue the bloodline? Because obviously that part is really important. So would they be getting a lot of pressure from their families to marry someone of the opposite sex so that they can produce children? None of that has really come up yet. I'm hoping it's explored more deeply in other books. Now you might be saying, but Julian, sometimes we just want a book where characters can be queer and it doesn't have to be, and they don't have to be opposed or challenged. And I'm like, cool, I'm right there with you and I agree. Except for the scenario that you have set up for yourself kind of naturally leads to some opposition, and it really should be explored. The main character loses her memory for 10 minutes for plot reasons, and really we could have done a lot more with it. It's brought right back. No harm, no foul. We just needed it to explain somebody's powers. And I was just like, everything in this book feels like so choppy and fast and half-formed. We have the popular YA trope of all parents are bad parents. Now, one of the parents in this book does get to learn and grow, but the rest, we just have bad parents. Because honestly, let's be real, when you're a teenager, it's fun to read books where parents are unhelpful and act as opposition to you, and you, as a teenager, have to be the one to oppose the parents, to save the world. The parents are wrong. That's fun to read as a teenager, because it seems very, very tropey. It's like, can't any of these adults be good parents? That would be interesting to explore. What if a child has to rebel against a parent who is doing nothing wrong? But speaking of parents, we do get a trope that I like with the main character who comes to realize that her mom is a person and her mom is struggling with pain and sorrow, but as adults, we are much better at hiding it. So the main character initially assumes that her mother doesn't care, when in reality her mother is just trying to be strong and hiding how much pain that she is in. And I really like that because I think that is a very common situation that happens with parents and teens. Teenagers are often very emotional and wear all their emotions on their sleeve, and as adults we get much better at hiding our pain, and sometimes that can be to our detriment because a teenager might think, oh, my parents are so stony, they don't feel things, when in reality parents are just trying, sometimes failing, to be the steady one so the teenager can be the emotional one. There's also a cat in this book, and there's so many fun options for the cat. Becomes her familiar, which apparently you need for some reason. I don't know. It's, again, barely touched upon. Everything is so wishy-washy. But there's lots of fun options for the cat, which never happen. I just wrote, we find out one of the characters has powers, and it was so absurd I laughed out loud. I don't even remember what it was, but I do remember the moment. One of the characters, we find out their powers, and it was just ridiculous. I was like, who thought of that? The craft itself in this book was serviceable, the words on the page, the sentence structure, fine. It told the story. There was nothing great, there was nothing bad. However, I'm going to talk about my biggest problem with this book, and I've mentioned it several times, and that is that it just felt underdeveloped. It felt half-baked, half-formed, like things were missing, like it needed to go deeper. It felt a little bit underwritten. And part of me wonders if it had been deeper at some point, and this author was forced to take out parts of her book to make the word count that was expected of her for publication. I don't know if this is a debut, but I know that word count is heavily pushed for debuts because publishers don't want to take the risk of spending a lot of money on pages for you if your book's not going to be a success. So I'm wondering, I have no proof of this, but I'm wondering if this book did used to have some of those scenes, some of this did used to be deeper, and then the author was forced to chop it up and pare it way back for word count reasons, and also because it is young adult. So I'm very curious what earlier drafts of this book looked like, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it just is like this choppy and this underdeveloped feeling. I feel like there's a book that I could love in here if it was given enough space, if it was given time to really develop this stuff. And you might be saying, well, Julian, just wait until book 2. For me personally, leaving stuff out and saying it might be in book 2 is not how to get me to read your book 2. This book was a bit of a disappointment for me, and the main reason is that it just feels choppy. So those are my thoughts on The Devouring Grey. Have you read it? Comment below and let me know your thoughts as well. Have you read the sequel? Does it get better? Should I give the sequel a chance? Because right now I'm not terribly inclined to keep going. Thanks so much for watching this book review. I hope you enjoyed your time here. If you would like to read something that I have written, you can check out my book, The Wolf and the Hawk, available now on Amazon in paperback, ebook, and audiobook, so you have options. You can check out more book reviews here on my channel. I have a lot of them, so you're bound to find something you've heard of. And of course you can support me on Patreon. You guys probably know by now, you've probably seen my outro enough times to know that for as little as $1 a month, you can get cool rewards like content that is not seen here on the regular channel. And at higher levels, you can get even more cool rewards. All the links to my social media are down in the doobly-doo for ease of your clicking. And I will see all of you again next time with whatever it is I happen to be doing next time. Bye!
I'm as poor as a church mouse that's just had an enormous tax bill on the very day his wife ran off with another mouse, taking all the cheese.
Well, thank goodness I have patrons. Patrons like Swamp Goblin Waifu, Ashley, Sophia, Merween, Kit, Hinglade, Persephone, Light Julie, Anna, Belle, and Sophie, Callison, Ray, Shelby, Zaire, Jesper, Irene, Scribbling Cat, Savvy, Jenny, Amanda, Lisa, Sarah, and Lennox. Thanks again for all your support, everyone. High in the halls of the kings who are gone, Jenny would dance with her ghosts, the ones she had lost and the